Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Deep Thoughts. I'm debating today. I am debating doing a show on addiction or doing a show on people worshiping. Let's do a show on addiction. It's going to be a little tough for me because I believe I have my addictions for sure, but my addictions are, I think, going to be slightly different than the ones that people are most concerned about, which are the ones that are more outrageous. And I have not put much thought into this. I did an episode a couple years ago about alcoholism, and I've had some great feedback from that and was really touched that people, at least a couple guys, had seen it and sort of pulled out of it. But addiction is like this little monster that's everywhere, isn't it? For some of you. This cigar I'm addicted to. This is the Herrera Esteli that you see. It's a Drew Estate cigar that you'll see in the intro for season 3. It's responsible for a lot of good episodes, so hopefully it doesn't fail us today. Every single time I've ever heard of a story of an individual telling me when they became addicted to something, I listened carefully and perked my ears up because I had always heard stories about how addiction removes your control. What was it? The heavyset girl in Dixie Chicks, who I think has lost all of her weight. She said that her father or stepfather poured cream into her cereal when she was a little girl and said, taste this. And she ate it, and it was obviously super duper massively sweet. And she said, from that point forward, I ate food because it represented this bonding moment with my stepdad and the sugar triggers from the taste of the food. That's a story I've heard one time, but it was so impactful to me. I listened and I was like, geez, wow. I don't think I look at a bowl of cereal anymore in my life without thinking about that story. That's the curse of my memory. Now let's think about it very analytically here. I'm going to parse a few hairs. Being addicted to something that's good for you, no one ever complains about. Being addicted to something that either is destructive to you or bothers others, well, those are the addictions that we are most concerned about, right? Nobody wants an annoying person in their life, and we don't want to have friends and family losing control. By the way, I apologize for the last couple episodes being windy. It's the Santa Ana winds here in SoCal. What's interesting is I don't hear any of the noise that you hear when the wind hits the mic, and it takes a lot to make this microphone have wind. But back to addiction here. Tony Robbins is a great resource for breaking addiction. And I'm going to give you the gist of what he does, but you need to listen to him to get the actual super duper techniques, because what he has are several techniques for different individuals to use, and so it takes hours and hours and hours to find the one that he's talking about that matches you. But the main goal of his mechanism is to say, you got positive and negative backwards in your mind. That's where addictions come from that you don't like. But addictions aren't just these little childhood things that your parent gives you when you're a little kid, I have a family member of mine that is the only obese person in our family, and the reason why he is obese is that when he was young, his parents were older, and working. And so in order to pacify him, they gave him money to go buy food, which obviously turned into candy. So those are moments that are innocent little moments that turn into lifelong dependencies and addictions. And then you have there's at least two other stages to this. And again, I am just pulling this out of my butt, so forgive me for not being more clinical about it. I thought if I researched it on the internet and got a bunch of 12-step programs in my head, then I would be doing the show a disservice and perhaps touching on something that is not in those formal stages of addiction. There's at least two other areas where I think that addiction happens. One is fairly trivial to understand, and one is a little more complex to understand. But one of them is a chemical reaction. You're putting a food in your mouth, a drug, and it's having a profound effect on your neurology, on your dopamine, your adrenaline. And when you start messing with the frequency of those two chemical supplies, and they've got it all figured out, by the way. They got it completely figured out. There's biorhythms of these chemicals being depleted. It's really a depletion algorithm, 100%. So they spike it, which creates a depletion, which creates pain. Now, it's safe to say that the human body has been perfectly designed, if it works perfectly. Now, if a father and mother are toxified during conception, if the mother toxifies the child during gestation, the 9-month gestation, and again, this is not about bad moms or bad females, because how the hell can we... It would be so difficult to protect our women in this world from toxins. You could never go out to eat. You'd have to make every meal fresh. You'd have to make sure that everything you get from the world is from a reliable source. You have to filter all your water. It would just be... It's very, very tough, and we don't know what the latest chemical is that's out there. She couldn't wear any makeup, couldn't brush her teeth with half the stuff that's out there, using hair products. The toxins are everywhere. And what's interesting is I think it was the first Batman made 1989, the movie with Tim Burton directing, that had it's the combination of chemicals that really kill you. And I believe that there's a lot of, truth to that. They just said that chlorine in a pool mixed with sunscreen instantaneously creates a carcinogen right on top of your skin. Super bad for you. Sold separately, just fine. But if a baby is taken care of from inception to birth, and there's no toxification, they're in some jungle somewhere, then I think that the neurochemistry in that mind is prepared to have a normal life, at a minimum. But let's just think of a perfect frequency, right? A little sine cosine wave in front of your face. And it seems to be in perpetual balance. It just hums like a note. And then we eat sugar. We drink a power drink. We do something. And it's not illegal yet, right? We're not even up to marijuana or booze or anything like that. And then it starts to process, as the wave starts to undulate, starts to go through some strange behaviors. Now, the body has always been designed one way, which is when it's in a perfect condition, there's no pain. And when it changes, there's pain. And that's how you know that something's wrong with you. The reason why a mosquito bite itches is that the mosquito bite makes your skin swell, and it's breaking down the travel of blood through your epidermis. And it needs you to scratch it, to rub it, such that you can stimulate the blood flow from point A to point B over the swollen area where your cells are starting to try and repair the bite. Right? And that's just being alive. Obviously, a power drink is just as intense as alcohol on one level. Hardens your arteries. That's why Red Bull gives you wings. It's all a big fucking joke in your face. It hardens your arteries and you'll have a heart attack. But no one's going to say you had the heart attack because of Red Bull. It was invented in European nightclubs because they wanted a stimulant to mix with the depressant of alcohol so that you would drink more at night. It's really made for mixing drinks. This is why when you drink it by itself, it tastes so fucking horrible. It's because it's supposed to be mixed with something else and diluted. But then there's spirits. Alcohol destroys your liver, destroys your brain it basically destroys your entire body by thinning your blood, toxifying your blood because it removes and displaces the pure oxygen in your blood supply, which is why you get loopy in your head. But that little loopiness can be kind of fun, right? It makes life sort of a cartoon, takes the edge off for sure. And what's interesting about it is, if you think about it, if you could take the edge off without toxifying your body, no one would be up your ass about it, right? Oh, well, they've had a really stressful week or whatever. Yeah, they should do that one thing, get a massage or watch their favorite television show or whatever. Now, obviously, all legal drugs are the kind of drugs that give you X amount of differential change to your body, right? Now, you can drink a lot really fast and get totally shit-faced, right? But where do we put those other things you can ingest that really rip you apart? Those are called illegal drugs. Cocaine, heroin. Marijuana, it's sort of a natural way to get to what you would get through alcohol. Obviously, it doesn't destroy your liver. And people don't typically get super angry by ingesting it because it doesn't rob the thickness of your blood nor the oxygen supply in your blood. There's all these conflicting studies about marijuana, which is really tough for me because on one hand, you'll have a bunch of reports about hemp oil killing cancer cells. Another one you'll get is stories about, the government essentially taking over the genetic purity of marijuana and, sliding something in that's not good for us. You'll have, studies that were done in the 80s and the 70s saying it can't hurt you at all. And then more recent studies saying that it can really put ant trails in your brain and rip you up. For me, even if, I have no experience with the hemp oil thing, but I've heard people say it does miracles. So if you're suffering from cancer, you might want to research all alternatives. See my episode, I believe, 17 on cancer. But my only concern with any type of drug that takes away your sharpness is that get your life completely on autopilot before you roll down that path, because you need all your faculties to see opportunity and to build skills in most cases. Now there's a handful of musicians and what have you, and artists perhaps that can use this stuff and it augments what they're doing. But if that's the case, then you better be really good at what they do, because that's going to be probably the limitation that you're going to run under, right? But the big drugs, right? I've never done heroin. I'm not even sure I've ever been in the same room with heroin. If I have, I was unaware of it. I tried cocaine twice. One, I put it on my tongue, which made my tongue totally numb for about probably 10 inches down my throat, which is like I was trying to eat a fish whole. And the other one was I sniffed a tiny line once, did nothing to me whatsoever. Oh, man, don't you feel good? But I'm like, nothing, man. Don't eat it. But opiates, coca leaves. I've got friends of mine who do coke, who have done coke, I should say, who've said it made them really mellow, and other friends that get totally high as a kite. So I can't quite figure out that drug. In terms of heroin, they always say you're chasing the dragon. And it's the first trip that you take, you get to ride the dragon, and then I guess the way it goes is that every trip you have after that, you can't ever get them back. I'll say acid's a very similar situation, although, acid is not addictive You may want to do it once a year, but that's not because you're addicted to it physically. You're just interested in the experience and expanding your mind and taking what you've learned in the last 12 months and throwing it into the projector and seeing it bigger inside your brain. Or perhaps you become more spiritual and you love man more. And it just helps you connect the dots a little bit better. Now, when I was in the Bay Area, ecstasy exploded. MDA exploded when I was here in SoCal. And up in the Bay Area, we had lots of deaths from just bizarre overdoses from these rave drugs. Raves were huge in the Bay Area when I was up there. San Francisco, for those of you who don't know. I lived south of San Francisco for 12 years. Very interesting place. So there's that second tier up. Drugs. Our bodies have completely different abilities to resist drugs. Right? If we don't understand that about drugs, then we're going to judge others the way we would judge ourselves, and that is not going to work. You can't say, well, I'm not addicted to it, so you shouldn't be. You shouldn't say that because it doesn't work like that. I have dated girls who have families that are alcoholics, all of them, including the girl. Of course, you don't know that when you're dating them. But you realize they have the gene that, one, doesn't get hungover in the morning, which is bizarre. I'm very glad that I get hungover because that kept me from becoming an alcoholic. But they also can just drink and drink and drink. It takes forever for them to get the slightest bit drunk. But there might also be something that's been probably fairly untracked, which is your genetic ability to deal with life. And I don't mean that as a criticism, because let me throw you a lifeline when it comes to that sort of criticism. As I've said several times on the show in different episodes, we're not built for this sort of life. This faux intellectual, level that we've been able to bring ourselves to and maybe legitimize is not the way that our genetics are currently predisposed. We're supposed to be very relaxed. Men's supposed to get up and hunt, get the food, bring it to the ladies. Perhaps in some cultures the men cook the food as well. I would definitely be one of those. Get a big barbecue going. But the ladies have the children, raise the children. I mean, just think about it. You carried the child. It's 50% intellectually your property, but 100% your physical property. You made it with your flesh and blood. And it's up to the man to feed you and clothe you and shelter you. That's the primal Cro-Magnon methodology that we're probably more genetically predisposed to do. So now you throw people into these high-velocity societies, and a bunch of stuff happens. It's strange. I've known several women in my lifetime, say probably 3, which for what I'm about to say I think is high, who were unable to drive on the highway because they get too much anxiety from getting in the car and driving. Sometimes they're really petite people, and cars are always built bigger than them, and so they can never really see the mirrors properly. They're nervous. And if you think about it, I drive a car, and I'm a grown man, so the car feels normal to me. But if someone said you got to drive this M1 Abrams tank to work every single day, and you're inside this box and you're looking through video cameras in a slit, a man would get nervous trying to get out of the driveway and not run over the cars parked around the house and kill a child running across the street. I mean, it would just be crazy. So you take society being overgrown and disproportionate to the genetics of mankind, and you might understand why people get really full of anxiety. Small people have to be very careful in eating sugar. You just can't ingest, a peanut butter parfait and expect to sleep well at night, because your body will metabolize that into energy, and energy, if not expelled through physical labor, will turn into thoughts. And just an overall jitteriness, which if you don't have explained to you why you're feeling that way, will start to wander, right? Those little tiny nuggets of thoughts that are bad, the little thread in the sweater that's bad, you'll start pulling it out just as a matter of addiction, and you'll start manifesting weird realities that don't exist. Well, if you could put something in your body, in your bloodstream, to numb yourself out, it quiets the voices in one way or another, right? The last category that I think is a major category, I think used to be really rare, and I no longer think it's rare. I don't have any real numbers, and I'm not sure anyone else does. But there are individuals who, for whatever reason, genetically, they are wired to be very uptight. Somehow, lines crossed, they're compulsive. Could be today, it could be the millions of shots that people get. But I have friends of mine that are my age or older that can't sit still in a chair. Friends of mine, they can't stop talking. It's almost as if they believe if they stop talking, their mouth will stop working, right? As Douglas Adams used to say. And you can see why they would like any type of drug to calm them down. How many times have you guys seen those episodes where someone is suffering on internet? The guy that's suffering from Parkinson's, he's shaking horribly. He's unable to speak. And they give him a huge shot of weed, like a big bong shot. And within a couple minutes, the guy is completely relaxed. He can hold his hand out, and it doesn't move. And I saw one the other day. It was just absolutely touching. And the guy stopped shaking. And then he said, "I could talk. Wow, this is unbelievable." And then he said, "Can we go to lunch? I would love to just go to lunch and talk. Because I don't go out in public much because I shake too much. I can't feed myself. No one can really feed me without great labor. And even if I'm sitting there and it all works out, I'm having a good day, I can't speak." But there are some people that don't have Parkinson's that just simply have this really tight wiring. You've probably met one person like this. And for whatever reason, they're that way. I don't think there's any room for, blaming them. Now, you do know folks that, for whatever reason, you believe that they were normal and they became a tweaker. They got strung out and then they behave like this. They're tight, they're wound up, they can't hold still. Maybe they're still a little bit high or whatever. But until you can certify that they were completely normal prior to getting addicted, maybe the addiction was a result of the only way they can quiet themselves. So that's the other extreme. Now, when I talk about the second tier of this whole thing with people that feel stressed, there is essentially the environment that can be too stressful. Like I said, you're from one of the ones I've seen a couple times in my lifetime are people that have immigrated up from Mexico, the females especially, who have had wonderful lives in Mexico. Their relatives have, right? And so they're used to this calm, beautiful world that's really more in balance with humanity. And then they get sold the promise that the big cities got all the money, which it does, technically speaking, but it was like a ruse. They were sold on something they really didn't need. But they come up here and then they get freaked out. But they don't admit they've got freaked out, and so they try to bluff. But in the end, it kind of comes out in a really strange way. So the reason why I mention this other area here, this sort of second tier to the second tier, is that, a lot of this addiction is either you're trying to get an extra high. You're already happy with life. You just want to go up higher. That's usually how it starts. How many people do you know live in the past, right? They can't listen to modern music. They can't ingest anything that's modern. And it's not because they dislike modern music. I mean, there's a million reasons to dislike modern stuff. But it's just what they remember is life was easy and life was good when they were young. And they want to go back. Because in the end, you were with your family members that are perhaps now passed. But if nothing else, you didn't pay all the bills. You had a community around you that you built into, that you grew up into, that was safe, even if there was a couple ornery people in the neighborhood. But sometimes life can get really rough, depending on how much you bite off, depending on how you turn the corner and what you find there. You could be with someone you think is wonderful for you, and they turn out to be horrible for you. I want you to go back to the sine wave that we talked about at the very beginning, this beautiful frequency that is you. Well, think about how many things can interrupt the beautiful flow and balance of that algorithm. Things that have nothing to do with you. Things that are just an attribute of society. And all you want to do is get back to the beautiful frequency that you were born with. Or that perhaps you achieved at one point. Or perhaps that you see in other people. If you're born in a bad situation, think about it, you would only know the bad situation. Maybe what's normal for you is a nightmare for others. But eventually you join society and you start to compare stories and you start to remap in your brain what was good and what was bad. How many of you have a predisposition that your parent gave you? Your parent was a particular way. It wasn't really a good way. Not to say your parent's a bad person by any stretch, but they had a bad habit. And you had that bad habit now because you maybe have a genetic trigger or weakness to it. I think that happens to all of us. But they start behaving a way that their genetics deals with society, deals with the sign of the times sort of thing, whatever's going on right now in society. And you tend to grab that, you grab a hold of it, because one, it's done in front of you hundreds if not thousands of times a day. So it becomes the norm. It becomes how you react to stress or whatever. And then later you start to meet other people and date around. You start to go, my gosh, I've got this attribute. I need to stop. If you can stop it or slow it down considerably, you can go on and live with life. The little frequency that used to be really smooth, well, it's not quite pristine anymore. I'm not sure any of us really have a fully pristine frequency. But what if you're not able to subdue it? What if life was great, but then you get hit by a Mack truck, as a metaphor? Something amazing happens to you that shouldn't have happened to you, something bad. Now, we never worry about the times when we get the big job promotion or the great opportunity. We get our break in life. We just take it and run. But man, when you get knocked the F out by something bad, it's hard to deal with it, right? But you want to fix yourself and move on. Well, if you can fix it, then you fix it. But if it's going to take a little while and you're going to have to eat crow or you're going to have to just be in someone else's crap that has nothing to do with you, you didn't do anything. Perhaps you're married with kids and your spouse walks out on you. And I mean walks out. You don't even know where they are anymore. You can't chase them legally because they left the country, disappeared. As far as you know, they're dead. But deep down you know they're not. Maybe they left you a little note. And now you have really a lack of resources to deal with what you're responsible for. So you got hit hard. The interesting thing about addiction for the chronically addicted is that in most cases they all have a story, right? And I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you have a story, because there are reasons why things begin sometimes. I've had friends of mine that have had really bad childhoods, parents that didn't love them, parents that told them that they literally should have aborted them. And they pulled through. They didn't get addicted to anything. They just lived and dealt with the psychosis of being rejected by someone that should have unconditionally loved them. And I've had friends of mine that lost their jobs and committed suicide with spouses and children being left in their wake. Young kids. But their self-worth was never restored after a corporation that they should have known didn't care about them cut them off. But they didn't have, one, they didn't tell us, that they were feeling so down. And two, we didn't know how critical it was to jump in and really grab them by the shoulders and stare them in the eyes and give them a hug and say, we're here with you until we're here with you forever, but we're going to be here with you in a very special way until you get back up on your feet. What's really strange about the last 12 months of Facebook is that suicide is becoming a big deal. A lot of people are pulling the trigger on themselves. Just happened in my hometown. A guy that everyone thought was okay, sitting out behind his house with a gun in his hand. Two police officers come up to him who know him because it's a small town, and they're not quite sure what to do. They don't know if he is violent towards others, violent towards himself. They're trying to talk him down. Unfortunately, in a small town, I think that there's not a lot of experience with massive depression. So, a cop walking up on a pedestrian in that situation, depending on their age, there's not a tremendous amount of wisdom there. Whereas if you come to the big city and by the time you're 30 years old, you've seen it all, man. But they tried to get the gun out of his hand. One of the officers even tried to tase him, and he missed. And the gentleman turned the gun on himself and killed himself. That's the extreme, right? On one side of the fence, we have people that are able to deal with it, or they're not challenged. On the other side of the fence, you have people that have almost never not known a challenge. They've never had their life be normal. And so the resolve there is some people take their lives and some people don't. Addiction is also something that happens with people that I think are very isolated. You could actually physically live with someone else, but if the interaction level isn't high and of a certain level of quality, the individual still feels completely isolated and alone. And that's where the drinking starts. It's where the drugs start. It's hard, as far as I understand it, it's pretty damn hard to do heroin without someone finding the tracks on your body. Cocaine, you can hide it up to a point, but it does show itself in various physical traits. You get nervous, you get all up, wound up sometimes. You get the sniffles, Weed, well, you're pretty wiped out when you're on it. Your eyes change. Alcohol, you can smell it. Smoking, you can smell, in general. I could never hide cigar addiction, trust me. One thing that I have discovered and seen happen several times for folks is that addiction, because it is the result of isolation, you're in a bad situation and you have no one you could talk to that you believe matters. How many times have you called your parents and your parents said, it's all going to be okay and you're a great person and da-da-da, and you don't care about their opinion? It does not mean you don't love them dearly. It's just the validation that you're looking for needs to come from someplace closer to what you're struggling with. So sometimes a friend, their opinion can mean more than your own flesh and blood. The opinion of a loved one, well, there's nothing more intense than that, because it is the person we have chosen to approve of and to have them approve of us. Unfortunately, we pick partners sort of with a willy-nilly bizarre process, don't we? Because it's almost like this juxtapose of logic, and that we want to find that person quickly, but if we're really to find someone that's really good for us, it should take quite a while, wouldn't you think? Now, some people are really lucky, and I cheer them on, and I'm envious in a very positive way. I'm like, good. When I see a good couple together, I get really happy, because I'm like, good, make babies, make happy babies, educate them, have fun, teach them about what's really important in life, because whatever you think is important seems like you got the secret sauce. I do not have the secret sauce. But let's go into other addictions because they're multifaceted, aren't they? There are people who twirl their hair addictively, pick their skin addictively. Once you find out that sex feels good, well, if you have an addictive personality or you're in a particular zone in your life, a particular isolated time in life where you're not feeling wonderful and you've got this little freebie thing you can do by yourself or with somebody else, or you can pay someone else to do it, you might just gravitate to that. We talk about on this show how we resonate with other human beings, and there's obviously a tremendous amount of truth to that. I'll give you some examples. You used to swear a lot, and you managed to fight it. You managed to, for the most part, beat it. You don't swear that much anymore. And then you travel someplace back to your old buddies, your old girlfriends or whatever, and they're swearing a lot for whatever reason. You see a movie that swears a lot. You hang out with just random people that swear a lot, and all of a sudden, as a matter of tribalism and perhaps legacy habits, all that hard work is flushed, and you come away from that world swearing. Now, it's not that you can't go back to your old ways and get rid of it, but for that time, you're almost embarrassed that you're swearing. So who you hang out with is important. It is important. If isolation is essentially the kernel moment in time when addiction can start, whether you be in a crack house or something, or you're with a bunch of people, doing meth, in the end, you're with people that are probably individually isolated in their own brains, and you're all together, and the only thing that beyond the drug that feels good is that you're with a bunch of people that seem to understand you, and your isolation is what you have in common. Your pain is what you have in common. And so it begins. But I think, there's very few of us that have probably been in those sort of tribal situations. Most of us, if we develop an addiction, we're by ourselves. And again, it has nothing to do with being physically by yourself. It's just in your brain. Somehow you're unable to express yourself in a way that anyone can really hear you. They don't reply back to you in any way that makes you feel like you're being heard. Could be that you're trying to protect your family and friends from what you're dealing with. If you're a father, for instance, at least in the traditional sense of, say, the 70s or before, in my hometown it was two times in the day when people would drink. The rich people in my little hometown would have 5 o'clock hour, and their cocktail hour. Everyone had a mini bar in their house. It was unbelievable. My uncle, who barely drank, had a big, beautiful bar, like a real bar inside of his house. But he would just sip wine maybe once a night, maybe. But he had a whole bar full of everything you'd ever want. He didn't drink it. Those are from his, the days when he was in his 20s. He was a doctor, so he had money. It's no big deal buying that stuff. But the more you sneak things that you think you shouldn't be dealing with, the more that you start to impact your view of yourself, right? Almost everyone who's ever been addicted and realized that that's something that's going on in their life, you start to self-critique. You start to feel bad about yourself. And it's the unfortunate thing is you do it in a way that is hard to shake. And what's interesting about addiction is that you sort of serendipitously fall into it. I mean, what's so difficult about taking a drink? What's so difficult about eating too much? Now, doing illegal drugs, well, it's a little bit difficult to get a hold of them sometimes, and then you find your little supplier, and then it's, well, now I have my constant stream of whatever illegal drug I'm taking. But what's really fascinating is that it's difficult to get out. Easy to slip in, difficult to get out. Because your original pristine frequency of thought and existing in this universe has either been subdued to a longer frequency, I mean, you're taking depressants, or it's been super duper energized And now you live in this completely excited, almost Richter scale of an earthquake inside yourself, and that is what makes you feel good. Perhaps if you're more into the excited state of being, then it's a distraction. It's almost a chemical distraction from life's interference algorithms as you've defined them. The comedian Woody Allen, who obviously has lived a life that some people approve of and lived a life that some people have a lot of criticism for. But prior to his, last 20 years of living, when he was living back in the 60s and 70s as this award-winning creative writer and comedian and director and actor, he was very upfront about going for psychotherapy. For those of you who are a little nostalgic about the past, whether you lived through it or not, one of the greatest series on YouTube you can watch are interviews with Dick Cavett. He interviewed all the masters in their primes, even some of the masters like Groucho Marx in his last decade of life. And they're very revealing interviews because, one, the interviews aren't these boring, pre-rehearsed questions and answers like they are today. Like if you watch Jimmy Kimmel or even the last probably 10 years of Johnny Carson, all those questions are rehearsed. All of the guests know what questions are going to be asked. They've pre-approved of the answers. Anytime you see Bill Burr tear it up on a late night show, he has brought his comedy routine to the writers of the show, and they say, well, if you ask me this question, I can lead into this bit, and it'll seem like I'm just whimsically writing this on the fly, but the guy spent months writing that stuff, taking it on the streets, testing it in little tiny nightclubs, and then he says it on, semi-live television, and you think he's just this, he's obviously a super talented guy, but it makes it look like he's writing it on the fly. I'm sure he's very funny on the fly, but I'm sure it's a little more blue. But Woody Allen talked about psychotherapy, and he was a very young man visiting a psychologist. But he was also a very intelligent man. And so what he realized was that he needed to constantly find someone to talk to remove the isolation in his life so that he could hear his own words, get a reflection session, and then perhaps hear some cause and effects associations of what he has revealed in his session. It's not really the goal of a psychologist to tell you what to do, because then become liable for their own evidence. The reason I mention this is that I want you to be aware of your isolation when you're dealing with your addiction. Now, sometimes you have the privilege of just saying, I don't want to be isolated anymore. I've got great friends, great family. I'm just going to schedule more time with them. But the reality is that there's two things. Some of you are not in a position to just go and turn that on. Now, my recommendation is trying to find a place that you can go to talk to others, but a lot of times those are bars, those are restaurants, Not everyone likes cigars, you have a smoke lounge, But there's yoga, there's perhaps a gym, some of that stuff costs a lot of money. You can usually find a friend at a beach, at a park, something. Park's a little weird nowadays because they've been used for so many nefarious things. But usually there's some club you can become a member of. But there's also Facebook with your old friends that you can have conversations with. But let's say that you take my advice and you find some beautiful places to talk to people. But you still have to come home at night. And again, regardless if your house is full of family and spouses and all that good stuff, you can still have a lot of little micro pockets of isolation, right? And what are you going to do when you're in that little pocket? Well, the second thing you can do, which is perhaps the way that I've escaped addiction in any chronic way, is give yourself a project. Give yourself a project that overwhelms you, that's fun, that's a complete fun project for you. It doesn't have to be associated with money. What I have discovered is in a lot of cases, people that think that their pastimes won't generate money because they haven't generated money, you just got to do it long enough and something comes around, right? I like thinking. That's one of my addictions. For a long time, I have just been filling up dozens and dozens of notebooks with all kinds of stuff that the day I die, if my family has the wherewithal to look through and read what I wrote down, it's going to be interesting. It'll be a bit like, Prince leaving behind perhaps 1,000 songs in a vault that no one's ever heard. Some are going to be shitty songs that no one likes, and some songs are going to be so good it's going to confuse Prince fans of why he didn't release the song. I created Deep Thoughts because it gave me a chance to say, okay, I think what I'm thinking is valuable. I would love to hear other people's opinions about what I'm thinking. And so I started cranking out these episodes. And by God, you guys showed up. I got a little bit of a Kickstarter from my previous radio show, MK Ultra Radio, with my co-host Kyle. But my first big boom was doing a Moon Hoax episode. And then the second gigantic boom was stepping into this arena of Flat Earth. It was interesting. I had no freaking idea the community was out there for Flat Earth. No idea at all. So when I'm here talking to you on this patio, I'm not inside being isolated. And as soon as I go inside, I've got, a brand new business I've been working on and a million other little projects. And so even though I'm isolated, I have things I can do with my time. And because I choose my projects, regardless of how difficult they get, there's usually more positive than negative. And the only way to take the negative and make it positive is to work harder on the project. So if I get stuck, I just work until I'm unstuck, If you have an addictive personality, what's interesting about using that power for good is that you can. You have a tenacious quality about you that can dig into something and hang on to it forever, in one way of viewing it, right? And so why not create a project for yourself and get into it? Perhaps it's just a tiny little hobby. I don't know what hobbies exist anymore. When you go to, say, Aaron Brothers or Michael's, which is a couple art supply stores here in California, Michael's is typically full of older women or their grandkids who are trying to learn what grandma used to do. When I was growing up in the Midwest, I had my computer engineering, video game stuff when I was a kid. I sat at home and wrote software. I wrote paint applications, and I made musical keyboards and video games. I was always working on a video game. I had my school projects that I had to do. I did other kids' school projects because they didn't know how to do them. I would go shoot guns with my relatives. On occasion, I'd go fishing. I was a lifeguard, so I would do that job. I painted a lot. So there's always something to do. There was no time for this addiction thing. And the whole thing was always this rumor I had read about Prince. When I first started getting into him, I realized that he and I had sort of this commonality, which I think a lot of us have, which is when you get into projects, if you can get ones that people can understand, for one thing, like you understand a painting, you may not understand how difficult it was to write a paint application on a computer with 32K, and you're able to make fonts work when there were no fonts, They might look at that and go, oh, well, that's kind of neat. I don't know where I would use it, but you show them a painting of Marilyn Monroe, and they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. That's great. But the thing I learned about Prince was he said that he would work all night as a kid because he was making music from like the age of 12 and up. He'd spend all night making a song and getting it all right, playing all the instruments, recording it, mixing it, all that good stuff. And he'd bring it to his friends the next day who worked on it for an hour or two, got bored, got tired, and went home because their mommy said so. And Prince would walk around the next day with the tape. And eventually Prince got a song called Soft and Wet to play on the radio in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, he worked his ass off, did that, and then got his first record deal. Made For You, which he stuck Soft and Wet on. He didn't like addictions for two reasons. He said, one, I lose control. He goes, control is the only way I have any fun in this world because my projects slash music slash practicing all the instruments couldn't be accomplished when he was, drunk or high. The second thing was he had no time. He had no time to smoke a bowl and be out for 4 hours. The other thing I've seen with addiction, which is sort of a bad news, good news scenario, has to do with the feeling of futility. You feel like you've messed up your life so much that you can't get out of the situation. You could quit drugs and it wouldn't make any difference, so you stay in them. Or whatever your addiction is. That's the bad news. But it's not real news. It's fake news about yourself. You meet people that have pulled out of it. And they've done something. We have a listener, I'll let him reveal his own name in this particular situation, but he's pretty upfront about it. He's had documentaries made about himself. He was homeless for quite a while. But he liked to draw. And when he was sitting there, he just drew. So he may panhandle for a little while, but, he's got his little thing out there, please, any donations you can do, but he'd sit there and he'd draw. And eventually, someone saw what he was doing, and I think he sold one. And people started, once he sells one, he makes more money than he made, per hour begging for change or whatever. And so he started putting these drawings out for people to see. And eventually he got known for being this incredible artist. And today he's doing album covers. He's doing all kinds of cool stuff. But he dug himself out. He took his isolation and he turned it into not just a hobby, but a career. And I dearly hope that he gets discovered. But really smart, amazing people with all the opportunities in the world noticed him. And now he's like them. So if you were to ever talk to him about being down and out and thinking that you couldn't pull yourself up, by your bootstraps, he would talk you out of it. Because you couldn't deny it. You look him right in the face. And even if you're like, man, I'm not an artist, he'd just look at you with loving eyes and say, but you're something. There's something about you that's amazing. Your genes didn't make it this far unless you were amazing. And that's the honest truth. Like I said many, many episodes ago, when I teach classes, I tell them all in the class, before we get started, and I don't care if we were in the ghetto, you're all special. Every single one of you. You have to be. Otherwise, your genes wouldn't have made it this far. Think about all the battles and the wars and the suffering and the victories that your ancestors have truly experienced. I mean, we like to talk about how America, fought through the Native Americans and the conquistadors and all those wars from Europe and stuff to get to where we are today. Some of that very bad, some of it heroic. But Europe has seen 50 times the amount of wars, if not 1,000 times the amount of wars that we've seen over here. Same thing with Africa, same thing with Asia and Eurasia and Russia. And hey, what if you know your skill and you don't like it anymore? You're bored of it. Well, the good news there is that you've proven that you have the genetic capability to have a talent in the first place. So just use the overall arc of your abilities to switch careers. It's never too late. Never too late. One thing I love in Hollywood is to find new actors, which is an androgynous reference to male and female, that became actors in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Perhaps they were unemployable the way they looked in their 30s and 40s. Perhaps they had no acting skills, but they go to a few courses, they realize they've always had a native talent for it, and they get in that movie or that television show because they look the part. What's amazing to look up is you take your favorite sitcom that went for like anywhere from 5 to 25 years. I mean, there's a few that have gone out there for a long time. Look up all the actors that have been on there for a while and find out what they did before they got the job being what they are today. And a lot of them will have pedigrees that go back 10, 20 years. They've done a lot of stuff since. But some of them only did that show or a couple pieces before. Stephen Perry, the lead singer of Journey. Even though I don't agree with his opinion of the ownership of the franchise today, he was nothing before he became the lead singer of Journey. And now I would say there's nothing that can remove him from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame of creating some of the best music we ever heard in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. Journey was a phenomenal band in its native form. Those of you who like Doctor Who, look up Tom Baker from Doctor Who. The gentleman that did, I think, 9.5 years of Doctor Who, and they consider him the guy that really locked down the character. There was 3 Doctor Who's before him, and he's the one that made it fun and whimsical and unpredictable. Well, what was he doing before he became Doctor Who? Some of you know this, some of you don't. He was a construction worker. He literally was building buildings and then going off to auditions and finally made it. And he went from 0, according to society's, scorecard of people who worship Hollywood, to hero. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, if you don't pick up on this already, your age has nothing to do with that. He was not a young tyke becoming Doctor Who. He was a man becoming Doctor Who. Who was going to support him? Here he is building buildings, and he's telling people, yeah, I'm trying to be an actor. Well, who's hearing that story and going, oh, yeah, you totally will, because this job says actor all over it, doesn't it? No. But he believed in himself, and he went and did it. Or he just kept trying, right? The other big one is that, they say, when you join AA, for instance, they always tell you, the first thing you got to do is stand up and say your name and say you're an alcoholic. And I've not met a person who thought that was a bad idea. Whether or not they continue going to AA or not is irrelevant. But the thing that society never tells you is that sometimes when you kick an addiction, it takes a while. Now, we've all had those friends that just stopped drinking. They stopped smoking. They stopped doing whatever it is that they were doing. That worked for them. And maybe you're one of those cold turkey kind of people. What I have found is, in many cases, the cold turkey people, they never find themselves looking for advice on addiction. They just kick its ass and they walk away. But sometimes we need a little bit of time. Sometimes we need a lot of time. But the interesting thing about admitting you have an addiction, I think, psychologically, is that you get to step outside the bubble of your addiction and look at it from outside. And that's a very powerful perspective, because it allows you to analyze it from a perspective that up until that point you weren't able to do it. It gives you more faculties, more analysis, more data. I think it's interesting that we talk about how the world's overpopulated from time to time, but then we talk about how isolated we are. It would seem that if we're anywhere near an overpopulated state, then finding other people to talk to would be very simple. I've been approached by, at least over the last 3 years, with my other show especially, I would say at least 3 males that were not in America who had addiction issues and life issues, and they would write me these beautiful messages through Facebook, and I would engage them as much as I could. Unfortunately, sometimes they catch me when I'm really, really busy. But the interesting thing happened for all 3 of them. Just telling me, a stranger, about their addictions, about their suffering, they self-corrected. And they came back a couple months later and said, you know what, I'm sorry I sounded weak, which is obviously not how I interpret any of that information. I interpret that as strength, quite frankly. But they said, just me telling you, I got to see my own words, and I decided that that's not the way I wanted to be, and so I stopped. And honestly, all 3 of them stopped almost miraculously, even if it took them 2 or 3 months to stop. That's relative to your life and time, that's phenomenal. That's super quick, isn't it? I made a habit a really long time ago to, and I've said this a lot recently, but I'm going to give you sort of a reminder because I've said everything I'm about to say in previous episodes. I made it a habit when I was young to worship those people that were in places I wanted to be. But when I say worship, I don't mean everything that they did. I mean what they did right, I paid attention to. And honestly, I didn't pay attention to other things. Now, I'm the kind of guy that will grow very fond of, say, a rock band when I was young. And but one thing I didn't do was put any effort into finding out what their names were in the band. I didn't put any effort into finding out what kind of guitar they play or drum set they play or where they live or where they're touring next. I just really loved their music and let it inspire me, you know? When I moved to California at 17 years old, totally by myself, nowhere to run, how to take care of my own life, which I had, for whatever reason, been able to do prior because of the bizarre childhood I had. I was working at Walmart in the electronics section, and this new rap artist showed up because I was heavy into rap about the time, I would say, Run DMC came on the charts, and I started noticing rap. And, you know, they were sort of latecomers when it comes to New York. But for me, it was brand new. But all these guys were older than me by at least 10 years. And so it was not quite accessible in my brain that their talent and success meant that I had a chance at being successful with my talents. And then I noticed a new artist in a movie called Crush Groove, I think it was, right? The guy walked into Russell Simmons, you know, fictitious company in the movie, and it was LL Cool J. His name is James Todd Smith. Ladies love Cool J, James, right? And he does this little song called Radio, and it was like, whoa, that was dense. That was completely different than the styles that I'd seen out there, and it was aggressive, and he was manly. And then, you know, I got the Crush Groove soundtrack. That's where I found out his name. Of course, they timed it beautifully with his first album releasing, Radio. And Radio was kind of goofy. You know, he was always good about being, you know, fun, because that's what lyrics were back in those days. It wasn't about calling women names and bragging about killing people. So I became a fan. And then I found out the guy's only a year and a half older than me. And that was huge for me. I was like, whoa. This kid was making it like 16, 17 years old. When I finally met him and worked with him for a year, and I've maintained, I would say, a very strong acquaintance level with him to this day, you see the guy and he's utterly and completely focused and driven for everything that he does. He is not ever resting on his laurels. He's never isolated in a way that, you know, I don't know him to this depth, but I would imagine he's got plenty of things he does. He either goes to the gym, he's learning his lines, he's acting, he's helping his 5 kids succeed. He's visiting his home half the year and lives in LA for the other half to film his show in CISLA. But he came up with a second album just before I came to California, Bigger and Deffer. And it was bigger and deffer. It was amazing. We didn't think he could touch his first album, and he absolutely blew it away. Unbelievable. But he had a song on this album called Breakthrough. And in the entire song, it's one gigantic verse, no breaks, and he never mentions the word breakthrough, which I think was ingenious. But the song, you don't have to listen to the original song. You can just find the lyrics for it, take a look through it. But you'll find out what drove me, personally. But the song is all about struggling to succeed, and the way that people treated him when he got famous and when he got successful, and just the way he observed life and observed people who had kind of given up on their lives, people who had gotten stuck in addiction. And he essentially used his male gene, his responsible male gene, and what he believes to be the responsibility of a man, and said, men don't do this. Men fight through all this shit. Now, obviously, if you've slipped and you're stuck in something, I don't mean to, heap any criticism on you whatsoever. Quite the opposite. But that set in me, in motion, my attitude towards adversity. When I looked at how much I was going to devote myself to something, it was maximum. When I said, how much am I going to polish something in the time that I've got available, what kind of critical eye am I going to use to look at the work that I'm doing, it was maximum, constantly. One of the greatest moments of my life was to be able to tell him that that's the impact he had on my life. And of course, look at me. I don't have any, urban black appearance to myself. So I'm coming in there with long hair, telling this guy, how much he impacted me. And he just looked at me and he goes, "You're the reason why I made the music in the first place, to touch people." So let me leave you with this idea. One of the coolest things you can do after you kick an addiction is to use your amazing intimate knowledge of the process to help others kick their addictions. And what's interesting is you start to see yourself in everyone that you help, because you are using your knowledge to help others. At the same time, you are, I would say, galvanizing yourself against a relapse. Doesn't mean it won't happen. I got plenty of rocker buddies of mine that, they made their 5 platinum albums, popped out, and found it very, very difficult to deal with the fact that just a year ago they were able to fill an auditorium with 20,000 screaming fans, and the next year they're, cleaning carpets. It's a true story, man. And they did go to the bottle in some cases. They lived perhaps a decade inside that bottle, trapped. And then the unthinkable came about, which is that people wanted to see them again. They wanted to see that old band on stage again, and they seemingly went from "it's over forever," this sort of destructive rhythm that they had allowed to infect their perfect rhythm, and they had it ripped away from them, and they went back to their perfect rhythm of being back on stage. And maybe it's not 25,000 people, but maybe it's 10,000. Some of these guys go to big rock festivals, and there's 50,000. And all 50,000 people are jumping up and down and screaming to their music. And the coolest thing about it is 2/3 of the crowd are the age of their children or younger. One of the biggest things a musician has to deal with is the fact that they think they created amazing music, which obviously they did, but the No Country for Old Men algorithm gets a hold of them, and they think, well, geez, the kids can't even appreciate real music anymore. They have to have the music auto-tuned, which isn't true. You're absolutely never, ever, ever too old to change your life for the better. Ever. Don't ever buy any bullshit otherwise. Trust me. Let me tell you, it's one thing to hear advice and positive information from someone that perhaps hasn't proven that their advice really works. But if you're listening to my voice, you're listening to an authority on the process. Either I have done it 6 or 7 times myself. I've had careers where, I'll just go through them with you. I've been a professional programmer of all different kinds of programming, right? I had to relearn completely different languages, right? When I was 24 years old, making about $85,000 a year in the early 90s, which was a lot of money back in those days. And my industry was disappearing. It was being replaced by the internet. But I had a standard of living that required about, $75,000 to $80,000 minimum. Well, I spent every single night working 4 to 6 hours a night after work learning the internet. But I was also an artist. I already had drawn and designed video games professionally for Activision. So I had this programming background, I had this strong art background, but I took all my programming skills and I moved them into internet languages. And I took all my art skills and I moved them into internet art skills. And so in one job switch, I took a little bit of a pay cut, but I got a lot less responsibility, which was nice. And I just moved straight over and kept my income. At the same time, I'm contracting Electronic Arts. And this time I was getting paid to do a little bit of programming, but a lot of game design, playing games, and critiquing how the physics engines were working. And eventually that built up into a reputation. I got called in to make the music for video games because we ran out of the resources we had. So I became a professional score composer for video games. Right after that, I got into just walked straight into the sound effects packages for video games. And we're talking about, console versions of video games, mobile versions of video games, the little advanced Game Boy used to exist back in the day. Then I started making scores for those little Game Boys because they had a bunch of limitations. So I had to write music where I couldn't play two notes at the same time. But they wanted these big anthems that, go along with Madden. I did the soundtrack for Madden for a Game Boy Advanced. And Toy Soldiers and a bunch of other cool games. I taught myself screenwriting. I've been able to write for some legends. The projects don't get greenlit sometimes because of other factors, but it's no reflection on my ability to write. Sometimes I'll just write a script and surprise a buddy and go, boom, I wrote the sequel to your film. Boom, there you go. And if nothing else, they know I got the skills, and I get called off to meetings to talk about these things. Eventually I got into helping to incubate films, finding the money, finding investors, working on the scripts, working on some of the conceptual art because I'm an artist. Eventually I got to engineer gigantic things like EA.com, which to this day runs on my base architecture. I can see it. I just go to the site and look around. I'm like, wow, all the same directory structures are there. The same flows are there. It's probably all been reprogrammed, but I didn't program too many lines of that particular thing, but I was one of the chief designers with one other guy. We're paying some company $2.5 million a month to do the engineering, and they didn't know what they were doing. But this street smart coder came in and schooled them with another street smart coder. Neither one of us had degrees in computer science. But I've been able to take a hobby that I've had since childhood, working in electronics, because my father was really smart in electronics. And now I've been able to engineer hardware. And I've been able to write software for a buddy of mine who created an LED hat. I was able to write all of his microcontroller software and just give it to him. I was supposed to get points in the company, but he's still struggling with that venture himself. But if I'd ever said I was too old to do something, you had to get in early. My buddy who became a legendary rocker drummer, he told himself at 16 years old that if he wasn't famous by 18 years old, he would be, he wouldn't have a chance. He actually bought a guitar first, didn't like it. His buddy had a drum set that he didn't like, and so they swapped instruments. His buddy became a fantastic guitarist, and he became a fantastic drummer. Weird, right? They switched instruments, and then their lives were launched. Everyone that you admire in the world, you should look up their entire history. Yeah, some people were lucky. Steven Spielberg, he got the right skills with the right father to help him incubate his eye for film. But by the time he was in his early 20s, he was already a man. He was doing man-sized jobs within studios, and of course he became an amazing director. Okay, so that guy's an exception. But I tell you what, 98% of everyone you admire struggled up to the point they had success. And perhaps they struggled after they had their success, and then they rebound. Well, you don't have to be in Hollywood or some fancy career to have all those paths for yourself. Keeping yourself busy such that your addiction will be your job. You'll be married to that sector, right? You got yourself, your family, and your job. Some of you are blessed to have a good self and a good family. Addiction only swims into your life because the job thing isn't working out. Okay. Your family did something before you were born. All of your family members. And let's just say you look back at your immediate family, your mom and dad, and maybe you can't find something in there that you admire, but I guarantee you keep going back and back. They fought. They succeeded. They won. And that's what you're made out of, There's an old analogy of Darwinism that's pretty interesting. It's not really Darwin, but if you put 10,000 people in some playoff, some bowling playoff, and you say you can only advance if you win the game. You can't advance if you lose one match. Well, one person out of 10,000 will win that tournament, and they will have never lost, because that's just simply the way that it works. Well, all of you are that person. We all are. We're all the person where everyone that existed up to the point we were born won, because they're still alive. So if you doubt your ability to get out of something, don't. You just haven't made the decision to do so. But you can do it right now if you want. And hey, even if you reduce just a little bit, that's a success too. How many of you have grown up drinking soda? And it was delicious. You went to Disneyland, you went to your favorite amusement park, you went to a concert, you went to a picnic, and they just had Coke. Your family always had. My father always had lots of soda in the house, right? When you're young, you can drink that stuff, and your teeth won't completely rot away immediately, and you won't be necessarily obese unless you're adding more stuff to it. But eventually your metabolism catches up with you, it slows down, and you start putting on weight, and maybe you get overweight or something. Well, just cut down on the soda. Drink iced tea. It's got a flavor. Try not to get it all sweetened up. But even if you reduce just a little bit, you've taught yourself you've got what it takes to get out of this mess. You just have to keep going, keep turning it down, keep replacing it with something else. So I hope you feel me. I hope this was useful exploration of your own mind. I'm always talking about how we're trying to rebuild society with this show. You know, I try to come at things from experience of my own and authority in a particular subject. You know, it's all one dude's opinion, right? I'm not sure that authority is something that really exists. I'm not sure that someone has, pure knowledge. I don't know, because we may be living in a different frequency. Every single person may be living in a different frequency. And I'll give you an example before we sign off here. What if people who think the world is flat are living in a frequency that's different than yours, but they are able to see you in your realm and you're able to see them in their realm? It goes back and forth, but they see it as flat. All the evidence they're looking for, they see. But you're living in a world where it's a heliocentric globe. And when you look at the world, you see a globe. But because you can see and communicate with friends that are in the flat world, you're totally confused while they don't see what you see, and vice versa. Maybe for some folks, physics is different, and 9/11 could actually happen the way the official story described it. But for you, your physics are completely different. It's impossible. It has to be a demolition, prearranged, pre-orchestrated, a false flag. But in their world, it's official story. For their world, they watch the Magruder Report, which is the video of JFK being assassinated, and they don't see the guy holding up the black umbrella, giving the signal for everyone to pull the trigger. For them, there's only a couple bullets, and not all the bullets that went through the windshield, hit the curb, and all the other shots that happen. They don't see any of that, because in their world, it doesn't exist. So, maybe the trials and tribulations that you're dealing with, other people don't experience. But you happen to be in that particular frequency. And this could be where my episode on dreamscaping comes in, where you can dream your way out of this issue. When you go to sleep, perhaps you can change the world you wake back up in. Or perhaps it's just a law of attraction. You change your frequency, and then you resonate back with the world that is more easy to manage. Who knows? There could be a lot more going on in this world than we know. It could be a lot more malleable, which is why we have Mandela effects, let's just say. Some people, it was always that way. For you, it wasn't always that way. But there's a group of us and a group of them. And we sit at the table going, geez, this is really weird. James Earl Jones thinks the line was, Luke, I'm your father, to this day. But it wasn't. It was, no, I'm your father, right? Bizarre. DeepThoughtsRadio.com for all the feeds. There's video if you're on audio, audio if you're on video. Video, you have two choices, YouTube or vid.me. Vid.me is about 5 episodes behind any one day, if not 10. But the cool thing about vid.me is season 1 is in its pristine condition. Someone really recently asked me about the theme music of season 3 in the comments. What music do I like? He's like, this doesn't really seem quite like you. You're not wrong. If you want to see the music I listen to, or hear the music I listen to, go watch just the first, 30 seconds of all the episodes in season 1. And that's from my catalog, my personal catalog, which is very varied and different. But that's the kind of music I dig. What I there's two reasons why I've gone with royalty-free music at the beginning of the show. One, I don't want anyone gagging my videos. Right, when I used a soundtrack in the first season, Europe and several countries in Europe will refuse the video to play. Sometimes it won't let you play it on a mobile device, but it'll let you play it on a desktop computer in Europe. It's really bizarre. So I wanted to get rid of that problem first and foremost. Second issue was I turn on, light monetization, so ads that roll on top of the video. For the super duper popular ones, I've let a pre-roll go because they're old. I figure what's the deal? I'm getting only a few folks, and if you're really interested in the topic, you'll push through a little 5-second ad or whatever it is, right? I've collected $105 off this show. I probably made another $100 in season 2, but I didn't have my AdSense thing set up, so there's a sunset clause in the ad model that you don't get to keep your money if you don't collect it within a certain amount of time. But I got all that set up now, so I make about $15 to $30 a month, maybe. We'll see how that works. For podcasts, you have iTunes, Google Play. If you don't want to go through any one of those devices, just get your mobile device with your favorite podcast reader installed. I use Podcast Addict, as I always say, on my Android. Just go to the website and click the RSS feed link, either clear at the bottom or the icon in the lower right, and it will tell your phone what to do. You'll have all the episodes. If you have any problem, let us know on the Locked Facebook group. Just look up Deep Thoughts Radio. It's a locked group. We do vet your account for activity. So if you got if your account is a few years old and you only belong to a few groups, like say under 50 groups, you're automatically in. Don't worry about it. If you're a member of like 800 groups and your name is unpronounceable and you only have a couple photos on there, then I'm not going to let you in. So far, so good. Hope this was valuable. Please, you guys are the authority on this, probably more than myself, so let's load up the comments with as much guidance as we possibly can. Hell, link other videos that are great. Things that helped you. Give us your scenario where you're able to pull out of it. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.